was the prophet of air power, the man who saw the future of war before the world was ready to believe it. William Billy Mitchell, the fiery U.S. Army general who dared to challenge the establishment, predicted that nations would rise and fall on the wings of aviation. For his boldness, he was court-martialed, disgraced, and silenced, but history would vindicate him. Yet behind the thunder of his crusade for air supremacy was a quieter, lesser-known story, that of his family of 5 children who inherited both the brilliance and the burden of his name. Billy Mitchell's life was defined by rebellion and vision. Born into privilege in Milwaukee, he fought in 2 wars, revolutionized military thinking, and defied the very generals who once celebrated him. But while he was reshaping the future of combat, his personal world was marked by absence, ambition, and loss. His children grew up in the shadow of a man who had sacrificed everything, career honor and peace, for his belief that air power would decide the fate of nations. Tonight we count down from number 5 to number 1, the 5 children of General Billy Mitchell, exploring how each lived under the long shadow of the man who was both a visionary and a martyr of his own convictions. Number 5. John Lendrum Mitchell II. John Lendrum Mitchell II was born in 1917, the youngest of Billy Mitchell's 5 children and the last to carry his father's fire into the modern age. Named after his grandfather, Senator John Lendrum Mitchell of Wisconsin, he inherited a family legacy of politics, service, and rebellion. But for the youngest Mitchell, that inheritance came not as privilege, but as expectation. His father's name had become legend and controversy at once, and every step he took in life would be measured against the man who had defied the U.S. Army to prove the power of the skies. John grew up in the turbulent years after his father's court-martial. The Mitchell family was living in New York and later Virginia, where Billy, stripped of rank, but not of conviction, poured his energy into writing and lecturing about the future of air warfare. At home, the general was still a commanding figure, disciplined, intense, and driven by a belief that history would one day vindicate him. To young John, he was not just a father, but a monument, brilliant, inspiring, and impossible to escape. As he matured, John followed the family's tradition of service. During World War II, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces, serving in the Pacific Theater. Friends and fellow officers would later say that his motivation was simple: to prove that his father had been right. He flew reconnaissance and transport missions, carrying supplies through dangerous routes where Japanese anti-aircraft fire and tropical storms claimed countless aircraft. Unlike his father, John never sought fame or controversy. His service was quiet, competent, and courageous. After the war, he returned home to a nation that now celebrated the very vision his father had once been condemned for. The Air Force was an independent branch of the military, exactly as Billy Mitchell had predicted. John lived long enough to see that vindication fully realized, though his father had died years before witnessing it. In interviews, John spoke rarely of Billy's trial, but when asked about his father's legacy, he would pause and say, "He wasn't wrong, just early." John Lendrum Mitchell II went on to work in aviation and government service, dedicating his later years to preserving his father's memory. He remained active in veterans organizations, speaking occasionally about the cost of conviction and the courage to challenge orthodoxy. He passed away in 1995 at the age of 78, long after the Air Force had become a cornerstone of American power. Among Billy Mitchell's children, John's life was the quiet echo of his father's thunder, proof that legacy does not always roar. Sometimes it endures in silence through the steady flight of those who carry it forward. Number 4. William Mitchell Jr. William Mitchell Jr. was born in 1915, the eldest son of General Billy Mitchell, and the child who bore not only his father's name, but the full weight of his legend. From his earliest days, it was clear that the world expected him to be a reflection of the man who had challenged the United States military establishment and been court-martialed for his convictions. But while the father lived for battle and the roar of propellers, the son's struggle was quieter, to find a life and identity not consumed by the shadow of a man history called both hero and heretic. Growing up during the aftermath of Billy Mitchell's trial, William Jr. witnessed firsthand the consequences of defiance. His father, stripped of his command and isolated from the institution he had served so fiercely, carried the bitterness of exile. Yet at home he remained passionate and articulate, filling the Mitchell household with debates about the future of war, the promise of aviation, and the blindness of bureaucracy. For a young boy, it was both thrilling and exhausting. William Jr. admired his father deeply, but longed for peace in a world his father had turned into a crusade. As he came of age, William Jr. chose a different kind of service. He attended college in Wisconsin and later worked in public administration and business rather than the military. Unlike his younger brother John, who took to the skies, William Jr. stayed grounded, perhaps deliberately. He once remarked to a family friend, "The air already belongs to my father. I'm fine with the earth." But even in civilian life, he never escaped the echo of his father's prophecy. When World War II began, William Jr. served as a consultant in war production and logistics, contributing to the industrial effort that fueled the air campaigns his father had once envisioned. He traveled frequently between Washington and the Midwest, helping coordinate supply networks for aircraft manufacturing. Though far from the front lines, his work quietly advanced the very revolution his father had fought to begin the transformation of air power into America's decisive weapon. After the war, William Jr. became a respected civic leader and businessman in Wisconsin, often called upon to speak about his father's ideas and the future of technology. Those who knew him described him as measured, courteous, and intellectually sharp. A man who had inherited his father's mind, but not his temper. When asked once if he resented being Billy Mitchell's son, he smiled and said, "No. But I've spent my life learning that even a prophet's child has to walk on his own runway." William Mitchell Jr. died in the late 1980s, remembered not as the fiery reformer his father was, but as the son who understood that legacy is both inheritance and restraint. In his quiet life of service, he honored his father not through defiance, but through steadiness, the steady course of a man who knew that every storm must eventually give way to clear skies. Number 3. Ruth Mitchell. Ruth Mitchell, born in 1913, was the eldest daughter of General Billy Mitchell and the child who most clearly revealed the tension between public destiny and private life. She grew up surrounded by the restless energy of her father's crusade, the constant hum of aircraft engines, and the fiery debates that filled the Mitchell household. Her childhood was marked by both privilege and turbulence, the daughter of a national celebrity whose defiance of authority was splashed across newspaper headlines. To the world, Billy Mitchell was a visionary. To Ruth, he was both a source of pride and a reminder of how conviction can isolate a family. Ruth was her father's mirror in intellect and determination. Even as a girl, she was bold, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge opinion qualities that delighted her father, but sometimes unnerved her mother, Elizabeth Trumbull Mitchell, who longed for normalcy in a family perpetually living under scrutiny. By the time Ruth reached adolescence, her father's trial had made him one of the most controversial figures in America. Reporters would sometimes linger outside their home, hoping for a glimpse of the general's children. Ruth learned early how fame could be both armor and prison. She attended private schools in the East and later studied literature and art, refusing to conform to the expectations of a military or political career that had defined the men in her family. During the 1930s, she traveled to Europe, where she witnessed the gathering clouds of fascism and war. In letters home, she described the militarization of Germany and Italy with a sense of dread, as if foreseeing the global conflict her father had predicted decades earlier. When World War II broke out, Ruth returned to the United States and volunteered with the American Red Cross, aiding soldiers and refugees displaced by the war. Her commitment to humanitarian work reflected her father's own passion for service, though she expressed it through compassion rather than combat. Those who met her described her as graceful but intense, a woman whose intellect carried the same clarity and conviction that had once made her father dangerous to authority. Despite her efforts to live privately, Ruth was frequently drawn back into public discussions of her father's legacy. She contributed to articles and interviews defending Billy Mitchell's reputation, especially as history began to vindicate his warnings about air power and the future of warfare. In one published essay, she wrote simply, "He saw tomorrow when others refused to look up." Ruth never married, devoting much of her later life to education and veterans advocacy. She helped organize programs for returning pilots and authored short pieces about the moral cost of war. Her quiet strength and refusal to capitalize on her family name earned her deep respect among those who knew her. When she died in 1999, she was buried near her mother in Virginia, far from the roar of engines that had defined her father's life. For many who studied the Mitchell family, Ruth was the emotional bridge, the one who translated Billy Mitchell's fire into understanding. If her father had fought to change the world, Ruth fought to make peace with it. Number 2. Harriet Mitchell. Harriet Mitchell, born in 1911, was the second daughter of General Billy Mitchell, and the child who most embodied his emotional depth and sense of quiet conviction. While her father was a man of thunder, outspoken visionary, and endlessly driven, Harriet lived by stillness, loyalty, and reflection. She was said to have her mother's gentle manner and her father's piercing intellect, a combination that made her both empathetic and unshakably determined. Her early years were spent in motion. The Mitchell family moved often between military posts, political hearings, and temporary homes as Billy's career soared and then collapsed. Harriet was just a teenager when her father faced his infamous 1925 court-martial for insubordination, the event that would define his legacy and shadow his family forever. Newspapers blared headlines across the nation, and classmates whispered behind her back. Yet through the humiliation that might have broken others, Harriet never faltered in her loyalty. She once wrote in a school essay, "My father says the truth is not always welcome, but it is always right." It was a sentiment that would guide her entire life. After Billy Mitchell's resignation and subsequent disgrace, Harriet became her father's quiet confidant. She accompanied him on lecture tours and often helped edit his manuscripts as he wrote books defending his theories on aviation and national security. In one surviving letter, Billy wrote to her, "You understand what drives me even when the world will not." When he died in 1936, Harriet was 25, and those close to the family said she was the one who carried his spirit most faithfully, though she expressed it without his bitterness. Harriet pursued a career in education and later in public service, choosing the pen over the sword. During World War II, she worked in Washington, D.C. in administrative support for the newly created Army Air Forces, the very institution that existed because of her father's ideas. To her colleagues, she was living proof of the line between legacy and destiny. Quietly, she helped shape training and logistics programs that allowed air power to dominate the war effort. A vindication her father never lived to see. After the war, Harriet withdrew from public life, living between Washington and Virginia. She remained close to her siblings, particularly Ruth and John, and continued to advocate for her father's recognition as the true father of the U.S. Air Force. Her devotion culminated in 1946 when Congress posthumously awarded Billy Mitchell a special Medal of Honor for his service and vision. Harriet attended the ceremony in silence, tears in her eyes, as she accepted the honor her father had been denied in life. She never married, dedicating herself instead to writing and historical preservation. Though her name never appeared in headlines, those who knew her described her as the heart of the Mitchell family, the one who kept the story alive when others grew tired of telling it. Harriet Mitchell died in 1987. Her passing noted quietly by military historians and veterans who remembered her as the steadfast daughter of a man who changed the world. She had lived her life like the calm after a storm, proof that even the fiercest legacies find peace through those who remember them with grace. Number 1. Elizabeth Mitchell. Elizabeth Mitchell, born in 1909, was the eldest of Billy Mitchell's 5 children and the one who remembered both the glory and the downfall of her father most vividly. As the firstborn, she witnessed the height of his military fame and the deep humiliation that followed when he dared to challenge the U.S. Army establishment. For Elizabeth, childhood was never simple. It was a study in contrasts, nights of elegant receptions among Washington's elite, followed by mornings clouded by scandal as newspapers branded her father a traitor to his own uniform. From an early age, Elizabeth displayed the same poise and intelligence that defined her father. But she possessed her mother's empathy and emotional insight. She was deeply protective of her younger siblings, often stepping into a maternal role when her father's career consumed the household. During the years surrounding his court-martial in 1925, when public outrage and political tension gripped the family, it was Elizabeth who helped maintain dignity in the face of gossip and ostracism. Friends would later recall how she carried herself with quiet authority, a reflection of Billy Mitchell's discipline tempered by grace. She attended school in the East and later studied languages and history, developing a lifelong fascination with diplomacy and culture. Though she never sought public attention, Elizabeth often accompanied her father to social events and lectures, witnessing firsthand the charisma and conviction that made him both admired and despised. She understood better than anyone that his battle was not against individuals, but against an entire system resistant to change. That understanding made her fiercely proud and quietly lonely. After her father's death in 1936, Elizabeth became one of the family's chief guardians of his legacy. She organized his papers, corresponded with historians, and worked closely with Air Force officers who sought to recognize Billy Mitchell as the true architect of American air power. During World War II, she served in administrative roles, supporting war production efforts, channeling her father's belief that technology and courage would decide the fate of nations. In the post-war years, Elizabeth married a diplomat and lived abroad for several years, residing in Europe and later South America. Her life among international communities gave her a broader view of her father's impact. She often remarked that the world he imagined became the one we live in. Despite her travels, she remained deeply connected to her siblings and returned often to Washington for Air Force commemorations. In her later years, Elizabeth was invited to speak at several military academies about her father's legacy. Her speeches were measured and restrained, but her words carried emotional power. "He saw a time when men would fight in the skies," she once said. But he also knew that progress always demands a price, and we paid it too. Elizabeth Mitchell passed away in 1992, the last of Billy Mitchell's children to die. At her funeral, an honor guard from the U.S. Air Force stood in salute, a gesture of respect not only for her father, but for the family that had carried his vision through ridicule, trial, and vindication. Among the Mitchell children, Elizabeth was the bridge between generations, the daughter who bore witness to her father's fall and the world's eventual awakening to his truth. Through her quiet strength, the name Billy Mitchell moved from controversy to immortality. The story of General William Billy Mitchell's 5 children is in many ways the second act of his legend, a reflection of how conviction, courage, and controversy ripple through generations. While their father fought for the skies, his children learned to navigate the far more intimate battleground of legacy. How to live under a name that history had both condemned and glorified. Each of them embodied a facet of their father's complex humanity. Elizabeth, the eldest, became the guardian of memory, the one who preserved his reputation with dignity and intellect, ensuring that his vision would be remembered not as rebellion, but as foresight. Harriet, the steady one, carried his moral backbone into public service, quietly building the world he had imagined without seeking its spotlight. Ruth, the idealist, turned his fire into compassion, transforming her inheritance of defiance into empathy and humanitarian action. William Jr. found balance on the ground, contributing to the machinery of the wars his father had predicted, while refusing to be consumed by them. And John, the youngest, took to the skies his father had once dreamed of conquering, proving that the Mitchell legacy could soar without arrogance, that it could live in service, not in spectacle. For the Mitchell family, vindication came not in one dramatic moment, but across decades of endurance. When the United States Air Force was finally established in 1947, 11 years after Billy Mitchell's death, his children were there to see prophecy become reality. The man once branded a fanatic had become the father of the Air Force. But for his family, the triumph was bittersweet. The recognition their father never lived to witness was also the validation of a lifetime of sacrifice. In the end, the Mitchell name came to mean more than just aviation or controversy. It became a symbol of the courage to see beyond one's own time, to speak truth before the world is ready to listen. The children of Billy Mitchell did not fight wars or seek fame. They carried something rarer, the quiet responsibility of vindicating a visionary. When the last of them, Elizabeth, passed in 1992, she was laid to rest beneath the same flag her father had once defended in defiance of its complacency. By then, jets thundered across the sky, proof that his vision had become the sky itself. And as their story fades into history, it leaves one final truth. Some legacies are not inherited. They are carried generation by those brave enough to bear their weight.